My name is Corinne Thomas, and I was the Senior Accreditation Coordinator who worked with the CET revisions to the standards for the last almost 2 years. We started this process back in April 2015 and met monthly to go over the different sections of the standards. So there was a lot of feedback that we gathered. We comprised the Standards Review Committee, which was made up of different service providers, CET surveyors, different advocacy groups from across the province. We had government input, as well as other qualified people and professionals from our sector, whether it was different service providers and expertise within them. So if your organization worked really well with complex support needs or aging in place, we may have consulted with you for those kinds of things. We also consulted with different government bodies, OH&S, so Occupational Health and Safety, and other groups like that to ensure that we're aligning with different legislation. We also had conversations with accommodation standards and those types of groups as well. In addition to the feedback that was from the committee, we, after every survey, ask for feedback from the service provider as well as the CET survey team. And we compiled that information and used it in terms of how to move the conversation of the meetings into what was important, what types of questions were asked. The questions of those surveys after the site survey was around what was hard to interpret and why, and how did you finally work through it. So that really gave us a good starting point for that information. We also contracted with someone to do an environmental scan, and how it was done is that they broke up every topic. So we had an environmental scan about homes and what does that look like across the province. We looked at choices in decision making, relationships, each one of those topics, and the person that contracted with us took and talked to different service providers, surveyors, advocates, government officials to come up with some information in terms of what is best practice, what are some emerging issues, that kind of thing, how it can relate back to CET. We also did a comparison with other standards. So we talked to different groups around the different accrediting bodies that we had, but also different legislation and the PDD safety standards at the time and accommodation standards. So now getting into some of the changes to the standard, to the CET standards themselves, what we found in terms of feedback overall was people and surveyors, service providers were really focusing on the standards and the indicators themselves, and there was a lot more to the manual than just that. So we started with the introduction to the standards section, and we reworked that and enhanced it to provide some additional information to help people get on the right track and be useful to them. So the first big thing we did was CET has a lot of terminology that is CET specific, and service providers might have slightly different definitions for those. And so what we did was define those as per CET. For example, in the human resources area, we defined what exactly we look for when we talk about subcontractors and volunteers. So for example, in that instance, subcontractors are people that do direct service work with individuals. So that would be the support home operators, the respite providers, supported roommates, whatever you might call it within your organization. It's not the plumbers and the electricians. Those aren't expected to have the same type of training as a regular staff would. We have also really expanded our guide to changes to hopefully better reflect the changes from the 2013 version to the 2016 version, and that has also been enhanced and includes abbreviations that are used throughout the manual. So again, we, instead of just having one spot where these abbreviations are and having you always to flip back to the glossary to find those, they're written throughout the manual in various different spots so that hopefully as an easier reference. We also, between the 2013 manual and the 2016 manual, we, well, as you'll see later on, we had to renumber some of the organizational framework standards. And so in doing that, we felt it more beneficial to rename some of the titles of the standards to be more specific to what the topic actually is. So for example, in the 2013, Standard 25 was honoring rights of individuals, but so was Standard 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32. So in this way, it is now the standard about intake. So it also helps because some people know standards by number and some might know it more by a topic. So hopefully that will be another way to be a quick reference to the standards. So some of the other changes that we've made across the standards is we've changed from using individuals receiving service to individuals accessing service. We felt that this better reflects the role of the individual within the service provider and the services that they offer, and we felt this was a more positive and accurate way to identify them. We've also made the manuals and the appendices easier to read by using text boxes, bullets, putting that definitions right in the side so that, as you can see, there's an example on the PowerPoint there of how we've used simplified language and making it so that it's easier to capture and hopefully find the information that you're looking for. So this is done in both the standards themselves as well as the appendices. We also got some feedback that footnotes were challenging to use and is a little bit old school in some respects. And so using this model in terms of having the definitions right there in the text with everything else was an easier reference point. The appendices of the standards was greatly enhanced. We got a lot of feedback that organizations didn't know where to find additional resources or information about a given topic that was outlined in CET. And so we've now added an appendices for almost every standard, as well as additional information, clickable links if you buy the electronic version so that you can access resources that are found online. Oh yes, we do also have updated our bibliography, which is at the end of the appendices with some really good resources that you can use and access as well as you're building your policies and procedures around any given topic. So some of the general changes that we've made to the indicators is, again, like we do with any revision to the standards, we take a look at what feedback and people said about duplication. We always try to eliminate the duplication, but as time goes on, we see that there are still some duplication. And so we took another look at that this time. And we made changes to the standards and to the indicators to reflect what we were actually looking for in terms of outcomes when it comes to seeing something in the standards more than once. So for example, we asked about training in the quality of life indicators around abuse and abuse prevention. So are individuals receiving training? We also asked that in the quality of service. Are staff receiving the training? Then we also asked for it in the organizational framework in terms of our staff and individuals receiving the training. So if you have the training all in place, it doesn't really cause a problem. However, if you don't, then you are actually getting dinged in potentially three places. So we've reworded the indicators to really focus on the outcome that we're wanting. So when we're looking at training at the organizational framework level, is the training there? So do you offer training to individuals and staff? And what does that look like? When we look at staff and the training indicators there, we're looking at how are they applying that training to their jobs. So it's not just, we don't care if they've taken the training or not because that is addressed in the organizational framework. When it's coming to the staff, we're talking to the staff and we want to know how they are applying it into their day-to-day jobs and do they know what they would do in those situations. When we're looking at training for individuals around abuse prevention, for example, is do they know what to do well, first of all, do they know what abuse is? Do they know what to do if somebody were to treat them disrespectfully? It's not so much important on where they got the training or how they got the training, is do they know that information? So hopefully that will eliminate being penalized for similar indicators, around similar indicators. As well, these changes, like in the example I just gave, better highlight the important concepts of the topic. So in terms of abuse prevention, again, what is important in terms of what do we want the individuals and what do we want to know about for the quality of life indicators around abuse prevention? Again, what do we want to know? What do we want staff to know? And what do surveyors want to ask the staff around that? Same with the organizational framework. What is the service provider's responsibility around abuse prevention training? All right, we're going to move a little bit more into the specific changes that were made in the quality of life and quality of service section of the standards. Now, not all standards had significant changes to them. So if the changes to the standards were just general and around the topics we just talked about, I'm not going to talk about them here. So that's why it may look like we're jumping and skipping some of the standards. So one of the most significant changes that we made around the quality of life and quality of service standards is that we put the quality of service indicators right under the quality of life indicators in the manual itself. So if any of you actually look at a final report, that is how the final report is written, in that you have the quality of life indicators, you have the quality of service indicators, and then you have the comments about that. So we mirrored that similarly in our manual as well. And the purpose for that was to, again, look at some of the duplication or some of the perceived inconsistencies that were happening. We only have one preamble, so the about the standard reflects and speaks to both areas. And again, less duplication because information is in the quality of life and then it's in the quality of service. It's all in one place now. So the setup of the standards themselves follows this format. So we have the about the standards, which is the preamble for both the quality of life and quality of service. And then we have the quality of life standard, number, and the statement. So for instance, individuals have homes. That would be the quality of life outcome statement. Then we would have all the quality of life indicators. Following that, we would have the quality of service standard numbers and the outcome statement, which are individuals are supported to have homes. And then we'd have all the quality of service indicators. This way as well, there's a more closer mirroring of the quality of life and quality of service indicators. So hopefully with surveyors as they're with service providers as they're preparing for a survey, they can look at what's asked for in the quality of life, and then the quality of service mirrors that. So with that in mind, I'm going to group the quality of life and quality of service indicators together and focus on the topic. So first of all, standards 1 and 13 about homes. The changes that were made to this standard is that we removed the mandatory alternate indicator from the 2013 version and replaced it with two alternative scenarios. So the first one is indicators that would apply if the service provider does not provide any residential services. So that would be day programs and employment sites. Then we have another scenario that is if service providers provide limited residential supports. So when we look at standards 1 and 13, we're looking when the service provider has full involvement in the residential site. So if it's usually overnight care, that kind of thing, and the service provider either owns or rents the property. In this scenario, we're looking at when the parent or the individual owns or rents the property. It's not the service provider's responsibility to be involved in the running of the home, paying rent, those kinds of things. So it's the groups such as supported and independent living, outreach. Those would be when those indicators would apply. When we speak about standards 4 and 16 around rights, one of the big changes that we made is we moved the indicators around advanced care planning from personal control to rights. We felt that that was a better fit. The other thing that we did is we took a much broader look at advanced care planning and the feedback with the different groups, and we even had a subcommittee talk to us about this. We also talked to Alberta Health Services and got some really good information around personal directives and just what a huge topic that is. And it's not just about do not resuscitate orders and advanced care plans. So there is some great information on the Alberta Health Services website if you're looking for that. We also have links in our appendices for that information as well. So what we've done in the standards as well is clarified the expectations around advanced care planning. We recognize that it's still the guardian and the individual's responsibility in terms of ensuring that if any personal directives are in place. But what we found is that when speaking to advocates and to parents, oftentimes they don't know where to find that information. And so that is when the service provider steps in and needs to provide that information. So what we're really looking for is policy and procedures for the service providers around how you share that information, so the communication mechanism around that. And then specifically, what is staff's responsibility if there is a personal directive in place? There is no set rule that we were able to find in terms of how staff are supposed to act in terms of having a do not resuscitate order or a personal living will or anything like that. So it's up to the service provider's policies and procedures to outline that. When we look at standards 5 and 17 on personal control, we've moved the indicators about personal care from the right standards into here. We've also added information about the use of excessive behaviors. And what we mean by that is we had a lot of great discussions at our committee level in terms of where do we put scenarios such as individuals who smoke and need support managing their cigarettes, or we have to lock the person's money in our cabinets because otherwise they'll spend all of their AISH money before payday or before their next AISH check. And those kinds of things. And a lot of discussion was around working with the individual and doing that in a very positive manner. And historically, that has fallen into the restrictive standards. And we just felt that there needed to be better monitoring and involvement by the individual. And so these indicators were moved to the personal control area with the focus that it's going to be a positive interaction for that. So if there does need to be any structured plan in place, that it's a planned positive procedure whenever possible. Therefore, the individual has access to their cigarettes. They just need to be locked up because that helps him not smoke them all in one day, but he does have access to them if needed to. Same with money. It's just helping budget so that I can go on a trip to Mexico. We recognize that sometimes restrictive procedures do need to be put in place with those. But again, having these indicators in the personal control section of the standards helps that individual to be involved and have as much control as they're able to have. We also clarified expectations around transitional planning. What was written in the standards before really was if an individual is coming from children to adults, you're there to support them, or going from adults to seniors, you're there to support them, rather than all the other significant life things that happen to a person in any given life in their lifespan. So it could be that they're moving to a new home, could be that their parents have passed away, guardianship, it could just be new staff coming on. So again, any type of transition that's identified by you as a service provider can follow under this category. When it comes to employment, we did some significant work around this standard. So standards 7 and 19 focus on employment only. So we've taken out that fourth scenario that talks about maintaining skills and moved that to a different standard. And that standard is 8 and 20. So now you'll see as we go, some of the quality of life and quality of service standards are now being renumbered. In the appendices of the standards, there is a questionnaire that organizations can use to help determine which scenario an individual would fit under. It shouldn't be the surveyors that are deciding whether or not that individual that they've talked to for half an hour should be working or not working. That should be figured out by you as a service provider, and then help the surveyors decide which scenario they fit in. Because within our new criteria here, they would either fit under employment or the new standard alternatives to employment, but they wouldn't fit in both. So we've changed the focus a little bit of employment standards to focus on a typical life employment span of a typical person. So our first scenario now is for individuals developing vocational skills. So they're looking at whether employment is right for them and focusing on different skills that might include how to show up for work on time, what to wear to an interview or to the job, what kind of personal protective equipment is needed. When we look at the second scenario, it's for individuals actively seeking employment. So this is where they're looking at learning how to write a resume, how to do interviews, talk to employers, that kind of thing. The third scenario is for individuals who are competitively employed or self-employed. So we've added an emphasis too on the ability of individuals to start their own companies and be entrepreneurs and build contracts and have contracts. One of the things that we have outlined in there too is the expectation, when at all possible, that if an individual is supported by the service provider to start their own business and run their own business, the contracts are directly with the public and the individual. It's not third party in terms of having that service provider be part of that contract. Make it direct as would in the typical world. Some of the other areas that the standards address is around individuals and helping them understand their roles in seeking employment, employer expectations, and the workplace culture. So we're really trying to build the bridge as service providers from being the stand-in that we will talk to the individual and then we'll go talk to the employer. Let's build the skills of the individual so the individual can advocate for themselves and do that themselves, and the service provider supports them to be successful. They don't do it for them. We also look at addressing the concept of self-marketing skills, so the individual being able to, again, advocate for themselves and to why they would be a good person for that job. That if there is any personal protective equipment, that they're supported to purchase that or get that in whatever means. Having safety mechanisms in place. We focus a lot around safety within the homes, but we've also expanded that to include safety within the workplace, getting to and from work in this example. And then we've also added the expectation of how service providers can support the employer who wants to hire these individuals but may not know what to do or how to go about that. So to help them build skills. One of the indicators specifically is around evaluations. So instead of the service provider doing evaluation and developing goals with the individual, is the service provider supports the employer to do that directly with the individual. So when we look at standards 8 and 20, this is a new standard and it's called Alternatives to Employment. So this replaced the fourth scenario and typically looks at the lifespan again of an individual in terms of how moving through life. So when all of us are done work, we hope to move into retirement. So that's the way the flow is supposed to work within the standards as well, between 7 and 19 and standards 8 and 20. However, but this standard also applies to individuals who are unable to seek or maintain employment. And the important focus again is maintaining skills. So it might be that they are retired and they have worked a full work life and are ready to retire. It might be that they have deteriorating physical or mental abilities like dementia or those types of things. Or it may be medically fragile. And this standard is only applicable after all employment options and scenarios have been exhausted. So again, as I mentioned earlier, in our appendices, we have a questionnaire that service providers can go through and help determine which scenario the individual might focus on and might be applicable to them. Recognizing that doing that questionnaire now and doing it again in a couple years might bring a different result for an individual. So it's important to maintain an ongoing process when you're looking at whether or not somebody is employable. When looking at standards 9 and 21 around leisure, we've added a new indicator around the scenario of individuals who want to participate in solitary activities. Recognizing that a lot of us might like to be social in our leisure activities, some of us might enjoy the solitary ones, such as reading a book, being at home, knitting, those kinds of things, doing things by ourselves. So we want to recognize that that's also an option for the individuals we support. We've also added a new alternate support quality of service indicator for supporting individuals who say they are independent when it comes to identifying and doing their leisure activities. And the focus of this is that some individuals are very capable and know what leisure activities they like to do, but some of them don't know what they don't know. They've always done bowling and swimming because that's what they've always done. And so it is the expectation within CET that there's opportunity for that individual to experience different leisure activities to see if there are other ones out there that they might enjoy. It might come back down to, yes, bowling and swimming is what they like to do, but it's an informed choice. When it comes to standards 10 and 22 around health, we've broken this standard into two parts. The first one is on physical health, And this mirrors closely what we had in the 2013 standards. The preamble itself has expanded to include some specific health-related examples, and the expectation that external resources and professionals are utilized. We've also changed the focus of the indicator that speaks to staff are aware of the individual specific rights to staff use their knowledge to be able to support those individuals that have those health specific things. So we're not just looking for in the file review that staff have seizure training or have knowledge and training in when working with people with dementia. What we're looking for is that staff know how to apply that information and how they are using that information to improve the quality of life of the individuals that they're working with. The second part has to do with mental health. So in this standard, Part 1 and Part 2 may both be applicable for some individuals. The indicators are worded similarly as what was outlined in Part 1 when it comes to physical health, with more focus on treatment plans and using resources and information to ensure that the individual's mental health is stable and that they're able to have a good quality of life even with any mental issues that they might have. We look at staff's knowledge and use of the training that they've received around that to support that individual. So when we look at standards 11 and 23 around safety, we really took a broad look at what safety is for people and how can we break that down to best support individuals to be safe, but still reflect and have that balance of the dignity of risk. So one of the things that we looked at is assessments. So when an individual has a behavior of concern, we right away do risk assessments and functional assessments and that kind of thing. So we've added that criteria when it comes to individuals that there might need to be a safety assessment done in terms of how and what needs to be done to keep that individual safe. And from that, mechanisms and supports can be implemented so that they are safe. Safety historically, like I mentioned, is typically in the homes. And so what we've done is expanded that. We want to look at safety in the homes, but also safety in the community, safety in the workplace, and when taking transportation. We also recognize that safety might look different at different times in a person's life. And so we ask that safety assessments be done periodically through an individual's life, specifically if a change happens. So if an individual breaks their leg and lives in the basement, that would be a good time to do a safety assessment to ensure that that individual who could independently get out in case of emergency, can they still do that during that temporary time when their leg is broken? And in that time, there might need to be different resources and supports be put in place for that individual. When they're out of their cast and able to walk again, you can go back to the original scenario that was in place. So as I mentioned, we talk about that individuals need to feel safe in their home, work, and community environments, as well as when transportation is used. I'm sure that you've talked about this with your individuals and seen this with many individuals, that there are times where there are many safety mechanisms in place and everything looks fine, but the individual doesn't feel safe. Or the individual says they're perfectly safe when there is a whole lot of red flags going on. So again, that's where it's important to have these discussions, whether it's a formal assessment or just conversations to get a plan and any protocols in place that might be necessary. We also have expectations around bathing protocols and safe water temperature testing. We've also added a new quality of life indicator. It's an alternate indicator for those individuals who are unable to ensure their own safety. They have 24/7 support, staffing support, and there is no real benefit to showing them how to use a fire extinguisher or that kind of thing. However, fire evacuations and those kinds of things are still very important for that individual, even though they may not understand and might always need staff support to leave the room. You never know what they pick up by that monthly continuity and learning that way. All right, so we're moving on to the organizational framework section. And again, not all the standards had significant changes, so I'm only going to speak to the ones that did. So I alluded to this earlier, but the numbering of most of our organizational framework standards has been redone. The reason for that is the standard, what used to be 46 in the 2013 standards, was service planning with individuals. And comments from the committee, the Standards Review Committee, was that it was often misplaced and maybe not as much intention when it got to standard 46, because that is about the planning as an organization and the governance structure and that kind of thing. So planning for individuals was not really the priority of that section. However, when you look at where the priority is at the beginning of the standards 25 to 32 specifically speak to individuals and all the different policies and procedures and practices that apply. So we moved standard 46, which is the service planning with individuals, to become the new 26, therefore all of the other ones moving up. We felt this better reflects the individual's progression from intake to service planning. Some of the other changes that we did is we moved the indicators from the former 23 and 24 standards of the quality of service area and put them under the related areas of the organizational framework section. We've also added a focus of the cultural and Aboriginal and the importance of respecting that and having individuals being a part of that. So there's numerous places throughout the standards where that is reflected. We've also added 2 new sections in the About the Standards, so that preamble section that is before all the indicators. And so that is policies that support that standard, and then any of the documentary evidence that supports the standards. So that would be any any templates, forms, any of those things that you might see as attachments in the self-study guide. The other thing around these 2 sections is that both of those are also in the self-study guide. So again, you'll see some alignment between some of the other documents that we ask you to fill out. So now when you look at how each of the organizational framework standards are followed through, it follows this format. So we have the About the Standard and the description. So that's that preamble that is still there. There might be some new sections. One might be the quality of service indicator introduction. So if there are quality of service indicators in that section, there would be a part of that preamble as well. We then have policies that support the standard. Then we have documentary evidence that supports the standard, again, which links to the self-study guide. Then we have the OF, or the Organizational Framework Standard Number and Outcome Statement. So in this example, the service provider has a process to manage risk. And then we have the indicators themselves. And then, if applicable, the quality of service indicators at the end. So when we're looking at each standard, standard 25 around intake, the current expectation is in most cases when an orientation happens or when an applicant is coming into service that there are assessments completed. So we have just added that into our standards. And we've changed the wording of one of the indicators from having you obtain full disclosure when you're working with an applicant to come into service to that you're requesting full disclosure. Recognizing you can only do so much in terms of your role in getting that information. That being said, we have seen some organizations develop their own internal processes. They know that they're not getting enough information when they are doing their intake, and so they've developed their own assessments and questionnaires to hopefully help get a little bit more information to be able to really provide the right support model for that individual coming into service. Standard 26, when we look at service planning for individuals, we've added cultural interests to the list when we're talking about the different criteria and components that make up the individual support plan. When we're looking at standard 28 around conflict resolution, we're now asking that some sort of documentation be in place and required for even the informal concern resolution and when that process is used, even informally. So we don't necessarily need to see as much details with the formal process because it might just be 2 staff talking or a staff going to their supervisor, but we want to see that there is documentation taken. So it might be minutes because it was done during staff performance time, or it might be on a contact note or communication note, just to show that there was some documentation, because again, sometimes those informal conversations can move formal, and then you do have the documentation to support that. When we're looking at standard 30 around confidentiality, well, we did reference electronic documentation and how that information is kept safe as it pertains to individuals. We've added more information specifically around the use of social media and electronic devices such as cell phones. Most organizations already have policies and procedures around that, so we're just aligning our CET standards with that. We've also added 2 quality of service indicators to this standard that address how staff know what to do and do they understand the policies and procedures around that. For Standard 31, for unanticipated situations or behaviors of concern, we've just put, again, just a little bit more emphasis on nonviolent crisis intervention and that training is necessary for all staff in order to meet industry standards. In the appendices, we do have a section that speaks to what is necessary to be a part of that training in terms of it needs to be done by a qualified professional and some of the learning outcomes that need to be a part of it. When we look at Standard 32 around planned positive procedures, when I was talking before about that self-regulation of certain behaviors, that is mirrored here from the personal control standards into here as well. So again, we want the individuals to have as much personal control as possible, so to be involved in the writing of a planned positive procedure. Again, that it focuses on the positive instead of the restrictive. It also has a bit of information about when is a planned positive procedure necessary. Some of the feedback we received from both surveyors and service providers after surveys was that there were times when they were confused about when there needs to be a planned positive procedure. So what we've included is a little bit of information around expectations for that. So for example, if you want the individual you're supporting to have a good day, that might be more of a protocol. I know some organizations call it a day in the life or how to have a good day with this individual or that kind of thing. If the intent is to address a behavior of concern in a positive way, so you have an identified behavior of concern, that's when a planned positive procedure is needed. So the two of the indicators that used to be part of Standard 23 have now been moved to the end of Standard 32. For Standard 33, for planned restrictive procedures, we've added 2 categories. So some of the indicators may or may not be applicable to you. So the first categories is that around the service provider does not do restrictive procedures at all. And the second criteria is around service providers do restrictive procedures, but at the time of the survey, they just do not have any planned restrictive procedures in place. So again, it just outlines which indicators would be applicable and which ones weren't. We have also added 2 quality of service indicators that were in Standard 23 to the end of Standard 33. When it comes to assistive technology and environmental interventions, we've added the requirements around the use of monitoring and recording devices. So this information includes the policy and procedures that need to be in place, as well as having consent for both staff and individuals to be able to use these. Standard 35 on risk management. We've moved the indicators around having full disclosure when individuals transfer to another service or within the service provider to risk management standards to better reflect some of the risk that may need to be passed along when an individual moves. We've also added the expectation that when it comes to risk management, that proficiency assessments are done in terms of the training and information given to staff, and that random checks around risk management are completed on an ad hoc basis. We've also added 1 quality of service indicator to address staff's understanding in their roles and responsibilities about managing risk. Risk looks different for the different levels of the organization, and so the expectation isn't that the frontline staff understands all of the liability and everything that goes along with the decisions they make, but they do need to understand what risk might look like for that individual they're working with and understand how dignity of risk might play in that. Standard 36 around health and safety, we've split into 2 scenarios. So the first scenario is around health and safety for employees, and that has not changed significantly from the 2013 standards. However, scenario 2, when it comes to individuals accessing service, we've created new indicators that are specific to the health concerns of individuals. When we look at the 2013 standards, a lot of the indicators could apply to both the individuals and the employees. There is some similarities between the indicators, but again, the outcome is different. OH&S, so occupational health and safety, wouldn't apply to the individuals accessing service. However, by having it in scenario 1 in terms of staff's responsibility, there is a secondary indicator that speaks to how individuals are safe because of staff's practices around certain topics. Other areas is regardless of the individual's ability, that they participate in mock safety exercises and that they're as real as possible. So we're asking that, the fire alarm actually does go off, that they do actually try and get out of that bedroom window rather than just talk about it. We also have added indicators in that second scenario around safe relationships and appropriate use of social media. So if individuals have cell phones or have access to Facebook or that kind of thing. For standard 37 around medication administration, we've split this standard into 2 scenarios as well. So the first scenario is typical to what we saw in the 2013 standards in that it talks about the service providers' policies and procedures and practices around if they administer medication. The second scenario is if they do not administer medication, and in that case, there are some minimal requirements. First of all, their policy must state this, but their staff also need to be knowledgeable of what to do in case of a medication incident. So while they don't need to take the full medication course necessarily, if an individual comes to them and says, I forgot my medication at home, does that staff know what to do in terms of supporting that individual? What documentation is required? If they find a pill on the floor, do they know what to do in that scenario? Ultimately, what we'd like to see is that these staff are also knowledgeable or know how to access information about the medication that the individuals are on. But we recognize that sometimes guardians and individuals don't want to share that information, but that again would be the best case scenario. Standard 39, when we talk about human resources, policies, and procedures, we've broadened our expectation around criminal record checks to include background checks. Now, we're not looking for a whole bunch more information. In most cases, it will still be just the criminal record check, the vulnerable sector check, or the child welfare check, or what you typically do right now. However, depending on the position, there may be additional background checks that are needed. So we're not adding a bunch of work, we're just broadening it so that if it were to apply, it still follows under this indicator. We've also added an indicator for supporting employees if there's been an allegation of wrongdoing. We added policy around a conflict of interest for staff. And that requirement was added because in Standard 42 of the 2013 standards, we asked that there be a separate policy around conflict of interest between board and staff, but we never asked for one for staff, so now we do. We have also moved the Code of Conduct into Standard 39. We also moved 6 indicators around quality of service, were part of Standard 24 and now have moved to Standard 39 here. When it comes to Standard 40, we've added clarification around policy when it comes to hiring and having contracts with subcontractors. Now, I've talked a little bit about this before in terms of the expectations of subcontractors, but we're asking that policy be in place that outlines what is necessary around the information and training you need to give to subcontractors, and then what would necessary and to be in the contract be also outlined in the policy as well. We've also increased the appendices in terms of employee success to talk about how to be an employer of choice. When we're looking at training and development, here are the indicators or overview of the indicators. So training must be provided to all employees, including subcontractors and volunteers, recognizing that for some subcontractors and volunteers that would look different. That training be customized for a diverse workplace, recognizing that there are many different cultures represented in the staffing that we have as service providers. And be customized to support staff who work with individuals with complex needs. So regardless of whether you go through the complex support needs review, you do need to look at what training is necessary for that group of staff. We also ask that training address sensitive topics such as aging in place, palliative care, other medical issues, mental health, those types of things if it applies to the individuals. And that training must meet the industry standards. Our appendices has some information about what should be included in terms of learning outcomes and industry standards, but the real focus is that it meets the needs of the individuals that you support, and that staff are able to understand and use that training to do their jobs and ensure that they're supporting those individuals to have the best quality of life. So we've added the expectation that staff need to be assessed for competency and proficiency around the training received. So whether that's a written exam, a one-on-one conversation during their staff supervision, a checklist that you go through, a shadowing, that kind of thing, mirroring similarly what we were asking for with the medication administration, but there be some sort of assessment done to make sure staff understand the training they took. Again, CET is not so much looking at did they take the training, yes, 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 but how is that training assimilated and how are staff using that training to ensure that the individuals receive the best support. For Standard 42, around employee satisfaction, we've deleted the former mandatory alternate indicators. We had a number of them throughout the standards that spoke to subcontractors having separate rules for them, independent service providers, that kind of thing. That has all been removed and everything aligns with the current standards. There's no alternate indicators for those scenarios anymore. When it comes to Standard 43 around board governance, we added a new scenario because there was a group that we found did not fall under Scenario 1 or Scenario 2. So the first scenario was basically you fall under the Societies Act and we're a nonprofit organization. Scenario 2 was that you fell under the Companies Act and were generally for-profit. So one of the things that we did in terms of clarifying those scenarios is the second scenario, we removed the expectations around social enterprises. Because if you are a for-profit organization and you have a business, that's just called a business. It's not called a social enterprise. So we removed that requirement. We also were finding that we were asking about board governance in that scenario too. And most for-profit organizations may have a board, but it's a managing board of the two owners or a group of 2 or 3 family members or that kind of thing. And then we're finding that we were getting confused as surveyors in terms of how that would apply in terms of the traditional board that we were looking at when we looked at scenario 1 around nonprofit organizations. So we removed that requirement as well. So the third scenario comes into play for service providers that have a governance structure that is an umbrella organization or multi-tiered organization where we are really assessing just one program or service of a much broader organization. So when CET comes in, we're not going to be talking to their board because the board makes the big picture organization decisions and has very little to do about the general operations of that organization's program or service. So examples like this might be Alberta Health Services, YWCA, government programs. We also added more information around social enterprises and how that we would like to see that work for organizations that fall under Scenario 1 of that Societies Act. So it's often we're finding not so straightforward in terms of, yes, that's a social enterprise or no, it's not. And so what we're asking now is that the board does its due diligence to determine whether it truly is a social enterprise or not. And that's the information that we're looking for. So if they say, yes, we've done this information, this is the documentation to prove that no, it's not a social enterprise and this is why, that's what the surveyors are looking for. If that information shows that it does apply, then we would like to see the social enterprise and those other indicators would apply. For Standards 44, for outcome evaluation, we've added one quality of service indicator that requires staff to know the organization's data collection system and specifically their role within it. So we're not looking, again, that the frontline staff understand every aspect of data collection, but they understand what their role is, just like the board would understand what their role is in terms of data collection. In terms of Standards 46 for overall planning, in the 2013 version, we added business continuity planning. So we've just added a little bit more in the 2016 and request that there's an annual review of the plan. When it comes to Standard 47 around financial management, we realized that nonprofit organizations and for-profit organizations fall under 2 different requirements when it comes to accounting. Our preamble or about the standard speaks to that difference. So nonprofit organizations fall under GAAP, which is generally accepted accounting principles, and for-profit organizations fall under IFRS, which is International Financial Reporting Standards. Still, the focus is around financial responsibility, but again, we moved all of that into this standard. So we've talked about that aligns with fiscally with the government, and that there's accurate employment and payroll records. We also added clarification around charging fees for services. So that can be anything from room and board or activity fees all the way to you are charging a parent or WCB or something like that to be able to provide services to that individual. Okay, we're going to take the next few minutes and just talk about changes to the survey process. We did send some information out and asked for feedback in terms of some of the changes that we were considering as a committee around the survey process itself. And from that, we got some very complete feedback, and so from that we've made changes accordingly. One of the first things that we've done is when you're submitting your paperwork to ACDS, we're asking that it be in electronic format. We're trying to save trees and move with the times in terms of electronic expectations, and so we're asking that it be submitted on memory stick or through Dropbox or WeTransfer or a system like that where information can be sent securely to ACDS and then securely to the survey team. So we do not want it emailed because that is not a secure survey or secure method, and often emails or policy and procedures and the documents are so large that they're not going to come properly anyway. We also ask that documentation either is in Word or Excel or that kind of thing, or if you want it more secure in a PDF format. But what we're asking is that you take it from that Word format and save it into PDF rather than printing it off, scanning it into PDF format, because that creates a lot more work for our surveyors. If it's saved from Word or Excel, they can still use the search function. If it's scanned and then put into PDF document, it's just a flat document and there is no ability to search, and then it makes our surveyors have a lot more time to go through the documentation. We've also taken our application form and worked it through and have moved it from 13 pages to 4 pages to just more accurately look for the information that we need. We found that there was a lot of duplication between the application and the sites or the self-study guide, and so we tried to eliminate that duplication. We have introduced a new service areas form. It's a very straightforward form, and it just asks you to list the organization's area of support, so all the different services, and to identify any new services that have been offered in the last 3 years. Some of the internal processes that ACDS has looked at changing is reviewing the participant list and, when all possible, trying to choose new participants then from 3 years ago. So when we do our list, we are only looking at initials, so this isn't always possible, but we do try to look at who was picked last time and not pick them again. Recognizing that we do a random yet representative sample, sometimes individuals do need to be chosen again because they're the only one that has a behavior plan or the only one that has assistive technology or that kind of thing. But we do try to not choose the same person as we did the last survey. We are also trialing a new online survey that is available, so you as a service provider would send it to any staff or individuals that are not participating in the survey to see if they have any feedback for the survey team that will be included in the final report. It has a few general questions about the services they receive, how they are using those services, and do they have any feedback around how to improve the services, and have they spoken to you as a service provider about that. We have also introduced a suggested agenda for that first organizational framework meeting on that Tuesday morning. And what we've introduced is the first 20 minutes of the meeting should be a showcase of you as a service provider. It could be talking about all of the great things and the innovative practices you have. It could talk about your struggles. Could have an individual come in and talk about what they love about the services you offer. Or it could be a staff doing a PowerPoint on the services that they are involved in. We found that organizations that just take that 20 minutes to do that have a much more positive survey experience because the surveyors and the service provider have that connection and just seem to have the surveyors just seem to have a better understanding of the services from that meeting. ACDS has always asked that we do individual conversations when we're having those conversations with individuals, guardians, and staff. However, some survey teams, due to time constraints or other ideas, would do group conversations. So what ACDS is doing is taking the time to really retrain our surveyors to ensure that they understand the importance of having those individual conversations to get the best possible information. We do recognize that sometimes individuals would rather have their staff or their guardian or friend sit in with them, and that's okay. But when their part of the conversation's done, they'll leave, and then the surveyors will start the next part of the conversation with that guardian or staff, because there may be some sensitive or confidential information that the individual doesn't need to be a part of. We also ask that guardians and staff never be in a conversation together, as well as staff and their supervisors will not be part of conversations. So again, training that we're going to give to our surveyors, but we wanted to let you guys know as well so we're all on the same page. One of the other things that we've introduced is if an indicator was missed for 2 previous surveys, that the third time it is missed, it becomes a mandatory indicator. And if you miss that a third time, you will not pass CET. It becomes mandatory, just like standards 31 to 33. We're just trying to ensure compliance and make service providers more accountable. So both service providers and surveyors will receive a document that has any indicators that were missed so that you can, it's not going to be a surprise when it comes to you at the time of your survey. All right, we're going to quickly go through the Complex Support Needs Review. So the general changes that were made to the Complex Support Needs Review match what we did with the 2016 adult standards. As well, the complex support needs definition, while similar to Alberta Health Services definition in the 2013 version, was a little bit different, and that did cause some confusion. And so now what we've done is we've aligned ourselves and do use the Alberta Health Services definition, just like all the other groups involved in this area. In terms of standard-specific changes, in Standard 22, we added one indicator about staff understanding the interactions between behaviors, mental health, and medical needs. So this might include some training on this, but again, it's that staff are able to speak to, for example, if an individual refuses to go to the dentist and has impacted wisdom teeth, that might increase their behaviors. So teaching them that it's okay to go to the dentist, they will go to the dentist and then have less pain and then less behaviors, rather than developing a whole big behavior plan to try and curb the behaviors. Standard 26, around service planning with individuals, we've added the requirement to obtain a more comprehensive profile of individuals with complex needs. So while the assessment and introduction for applicants remain similar, afterwards we do ask that a more detailed profile be developed so that the most accurate support model can be introduced for that individual. The thing that you'll see with the complex support needs indicators is that what we're looking for, what is above and beyond what is normally offered for the other individuals receiving service within that organization. And how can we best identify that, but through ensuring that additional assessments and profiles be developed that way. And we've also changed the focus for ensuring that, again, you've checked off some things by ensuring you've done these assessments. We're asking about how you've used those assessments in the planning with the individual. When looking at Standard 31, unanticipated situations and behaviors of concern, we've aligned this a little more closely in terms of what we ask in the abuse prevention standards. But if there has been a situation where there has been an unidentified situation or behavior of concern, that crisis supports are used and that individuals are supported during and after the situation or the incident. And that also includes individuals that may have been around but not directly part of that. We added 2 new quality of service indicators that ask staff about their knowledge and understanding about this information. And again, this is the additional information than just nonviolent crisis intervention. Again, that more aligns with the adult standard expectations as well. When it comes to standard 35 around risk management, we've added the requirement for 2 additional types of training, harm reduction and trauma-informed care. And I know that ACDS and Alberta Health Services are looking at resources and information about this type of training. Standard 36, again, has the 2 scenarios. So we've aligned complex support needs with those scenarios as well. And just looking that staff have the support that they need during and after an incident as well. So it's not just that the individuals need this additional support, staff also might need some debriefing and some time to decompress after a situation when working with someone with complex support needs. When looking at scenario 2, individuals accessing service around health and safety, we added a description of what individual-specific health and safety should include. So again, what is above and beyond what we look for in the regular adult standards. Standard 38, human resources planning. Our indicator in 2013 focused on that you have the staff in place. What we ask for now is we want you to show us how the staff in place meets the needs of that individual. And we've added 1 quality of service indicator that asks how staff use the human resources available to them. So do they use that employment assistance program? Do they need time off? Have they been part of the debriefing process or that kind of thing? Standard 41, we have training, employee training and development. And to match the adult standards, we've moved the requirements of what the training includes to the about the standard, and the indicator is just written that they have the training to meet the individual's needs and to meet industry standards. Again, we have the quality of service indicator that requires staff to show that they are competent and know how to use the skills from the training they've used to support those individuals with complex support needs. Again, that aligns with the adult standards. Standard 44, in terms of outcome evaluation, we had 2 indicators that asked for feedback. 1 indicator asked for feedback from internal stakeholders and 1 from external. So we have made that into 1 indicator. And then we added another indicator that asks the service provider to show how they use the information that's been gathered by that feedback. All right, in terms of children's standards, again, not all of the standards changed, so I'm just going to focus on the standards that did. The general changes, again, just mirror the changes that we talked about in the adult 2016 version of the standards in terms of having more bullets and text boxes and definitions, and so it's in an easier read format. We've also highlighted that in children's standards, very likely the parent is going to be the one that's answering the question, not the child. And this is also mirrored in our surveyor tools. The surveyor tools are actually geared to speaking to the parents and not the child. Standards 2 and 14 around choices and decision making. There's an additional indicator that focuses on individuals being able, or children being able to experience the consequences of their actions if it's applicable. When we look at standards 3 and 15 around relationships, we added the cultural component to that children have opportunity to experience that as applicable. Standards 5 and 17 around personal control. These indicators ensure that independence is appropriate to the children's age, abilities, and maturity, and that we want to align with the adult services standards in terms of being able to access external resources as needed to help with any assistive technology that individuals might need or children might need. In terms of 6 and 18 for community inclusion, that staff are able to identify community activities and then help the individuals and children be involved in that. We also added 1 indicator that recognizes the value of children connecting with their communities, especially when it comes to the cultural component. 7 and 19 around employment, we used to have in the previous 5 scenarios, so the first 4 wouldn't apply and then just the 5th one would apply to children, whereas what we've done now is 7 and 19 doesn't apply to children at all, but in terms of 8 and 20, which in the adult standard speaks to the alternatives to employment, this speaks to life skills, and those indicators mirror the ones found in alternatives to employment in terms of being able to develop life skills and set them up for future success. So that might also include, if an individual is older, that they do learn some vocational, have some vocational goals. Standards 9 and 21 around leisure. We've added indicators to address children might want unstructured free time as part of leisure, and that new skills are being learned. In terms of standards 10 and 22 around health, we've added indicators around staff's responsibility around medication administration and that they share relevant medication and health information with others. Again, this aligns with what was in place in the adult standards because we felt that this was still a staff requirement regardless of the population they work with. In terms of standards 11 and 23 around safety, we've added the component from the adult standards as well that when applicable, assessments, whether they're risk assessments or safety assessments, not just for behavior of concern, but if there's identified risk around safety, that safety plans be put in place for children as well, and that staff be provided training around that. This is the additional indicators for respite and for children and adults with disabilities. So when we were meeting with the Standards Review Committee, we found that neither the adult standards or the children's standards really accurately reflected what was needed in terms of when working with respite services. So when you look at the new respite indicators, these will be completed in conjunction with the adult standards or the children's standards, depending on whether you're working with adult or children. So there's only a number of standards that are applicable because of the nature of services. However, the expectation is that all organizational framework standards must be put into place for the organization as a whole. Within the respite services, there's definitions around what would respite look like for children's services and what it might look like for adult services, and what standards and indicators would apply around that. CET recognizes that expectations for respite staff can vary differently in the different scenarios. It might be something minimal as the parent just needs a break, and so they have planned all the activities, and you as a respite staff just take that individual out. It could be as involved as the respite staff has them for the whole weekend and must come up with the activities and is responsible for medication administration and personal care and those kinds of things, whereas in the previous scenario that might not be applicable. When you look at the different quality of life and quality of service standards that have respite indicators, some of them might not be applicable due to those examples. So an organization, or yes, a specific organization might administer medication, however, in that respite service they don't, and therefore that indicator would be not applicable. When we look at relationships, that we are looking at that the individual has opportunity whenever possible and as applicable to be able to connect with their cultural heritage. When we look at rights, we're looking at the same things we would with adult and children's services in terms of that their rights are upheld and that they're treated with dignity and respect. Personal care is around that their personal care, if applicable, is done in a safe, respectful, and dignified manner. Health has to do with medication administration and if individuals are able to administer their own medication, that there's assessments for that. And safety, we look at that no matter where the individuals are, that they are safe. The individuals knows that they are safe and that they can access equipment, resources, or their staff to ensure their safety. Abuse prevention mirrors what's in the adult and children's standards in terms of that they know what abuse is, are able to recognize, and that they're supported if there has been an allegation of abuse. These are the 4 organizational framework standards that are applicable when it comes to respite indicators. They're very specific to what is in place and applicable to respite services. So restricted procedures might look different. In some scenarios, we had feedback that sometimes parents will tell the respite staff how to interact with their individual, and there is no written plan. It hasn't been by a qualified person, and all the things that we've come to know and love around planned restricted procedures. And yet the respite staff is still expected to follow that as outlined by the parent. So it's a service provider's responsibility to ensure that they have policies and procedures in place to ensure the individual's safety, as well as ensure the staff safety as well. In regards to health and safety, working alone protocol is huge with this group of people. And so that was something that is one of the indicators within the health and safety section. Policy and procedures must be in place to address working alone, and that also includes when going into a home that is not owned or operated by the service provider. So if if a respite staff is going into a parent's home, while a service provider isn't responsible for what goes on in that home, they are still responsible for the safety of that staff. So protocols need to be in place around if that person is drinking, then they come back at another time, or those types of safety protocols. The last standard that applies to the respite indicators is around training and development. Training may look different, or does look different, in terms of when working with respite staff, and the only requirements is first aid and CPR, the working alone protocol, and then any other individual specific training that's going to help that respite staff be successful when working with that individual. So that might be restrictive procedures, it might be seizure information, it might be around some of the medical issues that an individual might have, like G-tubes or that kind of thing. All right, we are now done with the formal part of this presentation. So I want to thank you for coming today and taking the time to learn more about the 2016 standards. We will have a question and answer time now if there's anything more specific you wanted to know about. But hopefully this session provided you with some good information. So thank you for coming.